Hello everyone, my name's Lisa Stojanovsky and I'm part of the Global Launch Services team here at Rocket Lab. I'm super thrilled to be able to talk to you all at the Australian Space Biology Symposium for 2020. I'd like to talk about how Rocket Lab can enable easy access to microgravity for a bunch of different scientific payloads, experiments, and research projects. So traditionally for Australian researchers, there's only been a few different ways to get a microgravity environment to test your samples on. One method we heard a little bit earlier in this conference was a random positioning machine that can take your sample and randomly move it in different directions so that the overall effect of gravity on that particular sample is nulled out. The other alternative you can do is to take a ride on a suborbital vehicle. However, these suborbital vehicles only spend, minutes at a time in microgravity if you're going on something like New Shepard. And if you're going on something like a zero-G parabolic flight, then you only get bursts of maybe 30 seconds of microgravity at a time over and over again. And you're also subjected to some pretty high G loads in between those microgravity areas. And so is that really long enough, for all experiments, for all projects over all different scientific research questions? Is that long enough to get the data that you need to be able to really and precisely work out these effects on your samples of microgravity in both the space radiation environment? And so for those people, those researchers that really wanted an extended time in a microgravity space radiation environment, we looked to the International Space Station. And it did provide a whole bunch of advantages over those suborbital flights, but it also came with a lot of extra paperwork and requirements, because anytime you've got humans involved, the safety margins and factors go up immensely. So when you're on ISS, you have to get a launch broker and get your experiment on that launch, and then you're working with a payload broker that actually takes that launch space and ISS space as well for storage, and they help you assign things like the crew time, and that goes through the ISS office. And at the same time, you have to meet their safety requirements in terms of things like outgassing of any kind of paints or adhesives that you have in your project. You have to go through safety requirements in terms of toxicity and crew safety. And then when you're talking biologicals, you've got to have multiple layers of containment as well, because there's just, this real hard stance on not contaminating anything in the ISS, not bringing any risk or any harm to anything else on ISS, whether that's crew, whether that's other experiments, whether that's the structure itself. And so those requirements can get quite challenging when there's a really specific need that you have for your research or for your experiments. And sometimes because of that, you have to work with compromises in order to at least get that microgravity time that you wanted or that you needed. So there are some advantages to into the ISS, and then there are also some disadvantages. And one of them especially that I'd like to focus on is actually getting to the ISS and the time it takes to get up there on orbit as well. And so when we look at the commercial resupply missions to the ISS for 2018 and beyond, they're really staying steady at about 4 or 5 launches per year on the manifest. And that's, considering if you can actually get some cargo space on that flight if they're not already full. But when it comes to Rocket Lab, the launch cadence is actually increasing over time. So reaching orbit in 2018 with 3 flights, 6 flights in 2019. And this year, even with the coronavirus pandemic and all those disruptions to supply chains and labor, 7 launches targeted for 2020. And then Rocket Lab's also well placed in 2021 to hopefully get around 12 flights out to orbit, and hopefully increasing that cadence in 2022 and beyond as well. And so we're baselining a launch per month, if not more, as we go into 2021 and beyond. We've launched a bunch of CubeSats for NASA, and we've also launched the University of Melbourne, University of New South Wales, and in this next launch, Auckland University too. And ultimately, this launch frequency comes down to our ability to produce a rocket every week with our high-tech, advanced composite manufacturing and 3D printing facilities that we have spread throughout our California headquarters and our Auckland production complex in New Zealand as well. And for those of you that might not be as familiar with what Rocket Lab does, I wanted to show you this animation that kind of takes the launch process all the way from the beginning of launch to the end of the mission. So we launch from either our New Zealand launch complex or our US launch complex, and we have satellites on board ready to be deployed into their own orbits and perform their own missions. So the very last stage of the vehicle gets separated from the second stage. The second stage burns up back into the Earth, and the kick stage, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, completes a burn to put them in the precise orbit that they want. And then those payloads get deployed off of our vehicle. But we were thinking, we deploy these customer satellites, but we still have our own kick stage there, sitting there in orbit. And it actually sits there in orbit for a little while before we actually spin it around and do a deorbit burn to make sure that it itself burns up too, and we don't leave any space junk on orbit. But that led us thinking to a bit of an opportunity that we did have. So every launch, we have this free orbiting platform that spends hours or up to a few days in microgravity that's just kind of sitting there. And if you see this image on the right-hand side there, the payload plate, which is the white solid aluminum structure, sometimes has a lot of free real estate available for us to be able to bolt on additional payloads. In that image on the right, the circular ring is where the microsat attaches to the payload plate and to the rocket. But after that's deployed, that ring gets left behind, and there's all this extra space around it. So we took advantage of that on our third flight in 2018, and a customer came to us with a drag sail demonstrator that they wanted to test in microgravity, and you can see it on the left-hand image there. So that was compressed into the size of a 1U or a tissue box, bolted to the payload plate, and then after all the other customers' satellites were deployed, and there was no other customers left on board, the drag sail deployed from its little container and stayed on board, and we were able to kind of see the drag effects that it had on our kick stage there. And so they were able to use that extra room that without them we would have just turned around the kick stage and deorbited it, even though there was space there to hold on to something for a little bit longer and give them the hours in microgravity that they wanted. And I think the best part is that we're really well positioned to do this with, we've got the rocket launching, we own the pad in New Zealand, the launch range there, we control it, we have that kick stage or a satellite platform up there in orbit, where I've got a partnership with a ground station network called KSAT to get all that data back from its global network of more than 60 different ground stations. And then we've got our mission control facilities both in California in the US and in Auckland in New Zealand to be able to get that data back to wherever you, the customer, might be really fast. And you don't have to deal with a launch broker, a payload broker, someone who's going to be scheduling ISS crew time for you. It's just a one-stop shop. Okay, but what if you needed more than just a few hours in microgravity? What if your experiment needed, exposure to the space environment for months at a time, maybe even up to a couple of years? Well, to do that without kick stage in its current form, we had to give it a little bit more power. We had to give it an extra kind of kick, I guess. We upgraded it and we called this fully capable satellite PHOTON. And we added solar panels, we added better attitude control systems, better radio downlinks, and we launched the very first one of these actually this year in August, and it's still operational and it's still sending down these really cool, beautiful images from space. It's Rocket Lab's very first fully fledged satellite, and it can spend months there on orbit. It's still talking to us now, and we hope for many, many months into the future to be hosting any kind of payload that you want up there in microgravity. But it can go beyond LEO as well. So the images that you saw previously were of the LEO configuration of PHOTON, but what I'm personally really excited about is an interplanetary configuration that will be first launching next year as part of NASA's CAPSTONE mission to go to lunar orbit. So we had to really upgrade Photon to be able to take this CubeSat mission to the moon for NASA. It's going to be spending months raising its orbits to get to a translunar injection, and it's going to be flying through the Van Allen belts, so it's going to be experiencing high radiation. But in the end, it's going to be sending that to the moon. But that's not the only beyond low Earth orbit mission that we've got with Photon. Because in 2023, we're going to be sending the first privately funded interplanetary mission out to Venus, and we're going to be doing some really cool science with that. There's going to be a probe that we drop off as we fly past Venus that can take about 3 kilos of usable scientific instruments, and it's going to spend about 270 seconds in the cloud layer of Venus. So I am incredibly excited about this mission too. And the last cool science demonstration or physics type experiment that we're taking to orbit is for NASA, and it's going to be doing some cryogenic fluid management demonstration. So looking at how you control liquid oxygen and keep it cool in microgravity as well. And to summarize, if you're looking for something a bit less risky or less paperwork than going to the ISS, or potentially Mr. ISS ride, or you want to go more rapidly than the ISS resupplies can provide, we can add you as a hosted payload to the available real estate of our upcoming launches. Or maybe you want hours of microgravity as opposed to the minutes offered by suborbital rides. Again, we can put you on our kick stage, host you there, and get you the data that you need. If you want to go a little bit longer with your exposure to microgravity, we can put you on our PHOTON missions, our fully fledged satellite missions that operate for months at a time. Or if you're looking for even a little bit more of an ambitious or flagship mission, we can offer some interplanetary destinations as well, like lunar destinations, Venus, and even beyond that as well. So if you're interested, please let us know. You can speak to Lisa, that's me, or Sandy in my team at launch@rocketlabusa.com.